Just a little bit after the hour, so we're going to get started. So I just invite folks to find their seats.
Welcome everybody. Glad you could all make it. This is the second community work group, and this will consider the alternative adaptation strategies by sub-areas. And with that, I'll just turn it over to Ben Gilman.
Hi, welcome everyone, and welcome to today's meeting. I'm going to start with some introductions, and I'll kind of walk us through the objectives, the agenda for the meeting. Why don't we start with Tanya, and we'll go around the table. Name, organization. Oh, and one other thing too before we start is that I think because we have a pretty big room, we're going to ask folks to use the microphone when they talk. So it's I'm going to try to get them around as quickly as I can, but just for the course of the meeting, I think everyone would appreciate it if we use the microphones.
Tony Boykin, and I'm a business owner, business manager.
I'm Jim Kramer. I'm a retired oceanographer and I'm retired in Pacifica. I live in Chuck Park.
I'm Lindsay Bales. I'm a resident here in Livermore.
That's when we could have our resident and a wastewater engineer.
I'm Sam Casillas. I live in Pedro Point. I'm also president of the Pacifica Land Trust and board member of the Pedro Point Community Association.
Ron Makel, longtime resident of Pacifica, retired, also a member of the Pacifica Open Space Park Advisory Committee. About half a mile from the ocean. But I have a real interest in seeing our city stay keep falling into the ocean. I'm Jim Steele. I'm a retired ecologist and director of San Francisco State's Sierra Nevada Field Campus. I'm also president of the board of Friends of San Pedro Park and a board member on the San Pedro Creek Watershed Coalition. But my views are all my own and don't represent those organizations.
Mori Garcia, and a resident of West Fairway.
I'm Eileen O'Reilly. I'm a resident of Lindenmar. I'm a resident of Pacifica for 20 years. I'm a business owner in town, and I work in the real estate industry.
Cindy Abbott, and I'm park president of Pacifica's Environmental Family and the Park Beaches and Recreation Commissioner. I'm Ian Salkin.
Robin Rios, resident of Metro Park. Hi, Connie Menifee, retired deputy city attorney with the city and county of San Francisco. I'm a Park Pacifica resident, former Pacifica School District trustee, and current president of the Pacifica Democrats.
Hi, Shalini Darosh, and resident of Fairway Park.
I'm going to ask city staff to introduce themselves.
Good evening, I'm Kevin Woodhouse, City Manager of Pacifica.
Tina Warmeister, Planning Director for Pacifica. Bonnie O'Connor, Assistant Planner for Pacifica.
I'm James Jackson with Environmental Science Associates.
This is Matt Marvin in the back, he's going to be taking notes. Okay. So, as you'll remember, the first meeting we had a conversation around community assets and sort of what you value about the code. So that information was really useful in the vulnerability assessment. So now we're moving along in a process. Now it's sort of the question of what are the adaptation measures to the risks that have been identified. So what we're going to do in the meeting today is, since the last work group meeting, there have been a couple of public workshops. I know many people have been there, so I think some of you go up to speed. We want to make sure we get everyone in the room to speed in terms of what work has been completed to date, where we are now in the process, and sort of where we're going and where we're going to end up. So we'll start with that. Tina's going to give that overview. And then we want to just give a sort of a high-level look at what are the adaptation measures, or the tools in the toolbox that can be used. And talk a bit, James will talk a bit, what are the trade-offs between those different measures. And then we'll talk about what is the actual methodology, what has been the methodology that will be used to identify the appropriate measures or strategies, and what different considerations are being used. Many of those have been identified as priorities for the community. And then we'll talk about draft adaptation measures and strategies, and James will sort of clarify the terminology, but he's going to run through what are the draft strategies or measures being considered, and sort of talk about the implications for those. So that's what we're hoping to achieve today. The agenda is how we get there. It's pretty consistent with the objectives. The one thing I'd point out is that we will have time at the end of the meeting for public comment. So what we're going to do is focus the conversation between now and about 7:45 on the discussion among the work group members. And then we'll sort of open it up. If folks do have comments they'd like to provide, there's really two ways that you can do that. You can either fill out one of these comment cards, and then at the end of the meeting, we certainly invite you to make your comment. There's also a comment form that you can provide in written form, and the city will get it and consider it that way. So either of those two ways, that's a way for you to provide your input, which we would appreciate. Okay. So just some proposed ground rules. We do have a lot to cover today, so our hope is that you'll help us stay on track in the discussion of the adaptation strategy here. Please help me stay on the agenda, keep our time limits, and just recognizing there are a lot of different perspectives in the room. Hope that you just sort of interact respectfully with respect to these different ideas and opinions. And if you haven't already done so, please turn off or silence your cell phones. Thank you. I already covered this, but again, if you're interested, if you're a member of the public and you'd like to make a comment, please wait till the end of the meeting and submit a card. Okay, so with that, I'll turn it over to Tina.
All right, hello. So many of the faces in this room are familiar to me. You guys have been at all the meetings or many of the meetings, but we recognize that every meeting we're getting some new folks. So some of you, this may be redundant, but I'm just going to go over the process and where we are today. So Pacifica has a local coastal plan that was adopted in 1980. So it's very old and it's in need of update. The city has prepared a draft update of that document, but because of the time of when it was prepared, it does not include the required analysis of sea level rise and adaptation planning that the Coastal Commission needs to see. And so what we're doing is we are now preparing an adaptation plan which will inform policies that can be added to the draft LCP and then submitted to City Council for approval and ultimately to the Coastal Commission for approval. In March, the City Council adopted goals for the project, which are to bolster the efficacy of public safety efforts, to respond to climate change, to preserve existing neighborhoods and promote environmental justice and economic vitality, and to preserve and enhance coastal access. So the process is to continue to engage the community and stakeholders, identify policies and programs to facilitate the ultimate adaptation plan alternatives that are selected, and then to, of course, bring the ultimate LCP update to fruition through getting it approved, both through the City Council and Coastal Commission. The city council, recognizing that additional community engagement was needed, did authorize additional public meetings, which we now have held 2 additional public meetings, and additional outreach in the form of a citywide mailer and staff representation at special events. The next meeting will be a public meeting on Saturday, June 23rd at noon here in this room. Here is the website. You guys are probably all familiar with that, but if you're not, please visit it. It's got a lot of good information, and you can sign up to receive email updates. Here's our graphic on the planning process, and we are currently preparing the adaptation plan and ultimately going to prepare some policy options for consideration. Here we are, kind of smack in the middle of our schedule, and coming up in summer and fall, we'll be working on policy updates and moving on to public hearings. These slides are just another summary of the process. After these meetings, the city will be working with ESA to identify the adaptation alternatives that will be studied. We'll prepare the draft adaptation plan and release to the public. And then we'll proceed on to the approval process that I summarized. With that, over to you.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Good to see everyone here. Glad we can compete against the televised game that's going on right now. So I appreciate you prioritizing
Don't tell us anything.
your
Here's
community.
something, don't say anything.
I will not be providing score updates throughout the presentation. Sorry. So adaptation. What are we going to do about sea level rise? We've worked. The city and ESA has worked together to compile a list of adaptation measures that were deemed suitable for Pacifica, and those were described in our first memo that was issued on adaptation. I can't remember the exact name, but example adaptation strategies, in which we listed and described all the specific tools that could be used to deal with sea level rise, erosion, and flooding in the city. And those things ranged from measures that focused on land use, like development setbacks for new development to remove any new development at a safe distance from the bluff, or things like armoring with rock protection, rock revetment. That's another individual measure that can be considered and has been used extensively already. Other things like raising structures is a way to accommodate for higher flood levels. So we looked at all the available tools and came up with a list. And so we have come down to a few alternatives for each sub area, and we're going to go through an analysis of these different alternatives in order to get a good picture on what are the costs and benefits associated with a range of alternatives. And so one thing I wanted to talk about before we get into this is what's the purpose of this analysis, looking at different alternatives, alternative strategies to deal with sea level rise. And to clarify what this does and does not do, I've got a few bullets here. And so, like I just said, this analysis is the purpose of which is to test a reasonable number of approaches, or as we're calling them, adaptation strategies, and see what are the costs and benefits of each strategy so that we can think together in the city and decide how it would like to move forward and what it would like to include in its adaptation plan. So in order to do this analysis, we do have to define what the strategies look like through time. And you do that by looking at the state guidance on sea level rise and the types of scenarios that we've chosen for the study. And we need to determine or use an approach that can define when things need to be done. And so we're looking at state guidance on sea level rise projections in order to say, For example, how often do we need to be nourishing the beach in this location in order to maintain the beach? And so we look at sea level rise and erosion and come up with the timing of that. So it does define these strategies over time for the purpose of the analysis. What it does not do is define what Pacifica is going to do. Just because we have a strategy that we're looking at, it doesn't mean that the city is going to necessarily pursue that in its adaptation plan and the associated policies down the line. So this is just a test case. And it also doesn't force Pacifica to assume that high sea level rise will occur. Sea level rise science is, there's a lot of uncertainty involved. And so in order to play these alternatives out through time, we need to assume a certain amount of sea level rise. What we're not going to do is say that Pacifica is going to continue to march forward and plan, assuming that any amount of sea level rise will occur at a given time. Instead, we will use a trigger-based approach that will initiate types of actions, like planning for upgrading of the structure to protect the coastline, or planning to raise a levee or other facility. And so those types of triggers are tied to observable effects. It could be a certain amount of sea level rise that has occurred. Say if sea level rises by 2 feet, then we need to start planning for this type of flood protection measure. Or if a certain amount of erosion occurs on the shoreline or on a bluff, then we need to start engaging in these adaptation activities. So I wanted to explain how, while we're assuming a certain amount of sea level rise to come up with these strategies, the plan is not assuming that amount of sea level rise or that scenario is going to occur and that's taken as fact. The plan will actually be based and more flexible on observable change that may or may not occur, and if it doesn't occur, then our adaptation or actions will not necessarily proceed as far. Also, in these adaptation alternatives, we can't consider everything. There's a limit to what we can do in this study, and so just because a particular measure is not included in a strategy for a given area doesn't mean that it is not allowed or it's not going to be considered in the future. A lot of measures can be replaced by other similar measures, and perhaps there will be new land use type actions that can be created in the future to facilitate more adaptation. So anyway, if we don't include a particular measure, it doesn't mean it's not valid and may not be considered in the future. So those are just a couple of.
So James, I just want to provide just sort of a fine point on it. So if you look at the memo, for example, and where James is going to walk us through each of the sub areas, you'll notice there's 3 or 4 potential strategies, and the outcome of the adaptation plan is not necessarily to identify a preferred alternative or preferred strategy. It's really to create a manageable set of strategies through which ESA can then run the technical, sort of the cost benefit and other considerations to be able to compare them. So we're not necessarily selecting the preferred. So I just want to make sure that's clear.
Thank you, Ben.
I just feel like at the outset here, I've got to register a procedural complaint that this memo came out to the public at 5:58, to us on the working group at 5:41 p.m. yesterday, literally the eve before this meeting. And I know probably everybody in this room was CC'd on an email from Richard Harris, and I have to concur with his opinion that, particularly because the highly controversial managed retreat option appears in the May 30th memo for many of the sub-areas, including Sharp Park, whereas it did not so appear in the April 18th memo, the less than 1 day notice of the new memo prior to the May 31st public meeting is a failure of process that should be corrected. So I just feel duty bound to say that for the record.
Thank you, Con.
This might be a good time to sort of address the management tree comment, because I think that's an important one. So James, I didn't know if you wanted to do that, or if you
Sure.
wanted to do that? So whoever, but.
I'd be happy to. So, yes, it does appear in all the sub areas now, and that was at the direction of the Coastal Commission. We met with the Coastal Commission on the phone last week, and their main concern with our strategies was that we did not consider at all any managed retreat for most of the sub areas. There are 2 sub areas in which managed retreat was identified as a feasible option. And so we are including managed retreat as a alternative strategy at the direction and requirement of the Coastal Commission. And as bullet number 2 says, it doesn't, what is the one, does not define what we're going to do. It doesn't mean that we're going to manage retreat in all these areas. The Coastal Commission is merely looking for a reasonable analysis of a range of options, and they want people to look at managed retreat. If anyone's followed the Del Mar LCP update process, Del Mar tried to get by without having any managed retreat considered, and the Coastal Commission after the fact forced them to add it back in. So we're doing this at the request of the Coastal Commission in order to show what the costs and benefits of such a strategy would be, and we'll move forward with the adaptation plan considering those costs and benefits. It's not to say that we are going to recommend managed retreat in all these areas. It's just that we should look at it, and it makes sense that it's one thing that's been identified from the Coastal Commission, and they have are requiring us to look at it. So that's why it's been added, and we'll see how the numbers play out, but it doesn't mean that we're promising to retreat in all these sub areas.
Yeah, except I'm talking procedurally, this is all, even though a lot of it is cut and paste from the prior memo, it would have been nicer to have been given more time to fully digest this.
I agree. Apologies for the last minute nature of that. So,
Ask the question.
Hold on. Sorry, I'm gonna have to warn this down.
Are we listening to a presentation or are we interrupting, please?
This is your meeting. I'm going to help you guys, but if things aren't clear before we go on to these, let's get clarity. But we want to get through this meeting in 2 hours, so you guys have to help me manage.
My question is on managed retreating, and I think there are times that would be the last scenario that we would have to consider, sort of the last option. But I would see the city council here in the city saying that what we want to do is we want to protect our infrastructure, our buildings, we want to protect the community as much as possible. And so we would want to do a lot more revetments or armoring. Where I could see the Coastal Commission, their mission has been something very different, to protect the beaches. And so one concern is the city here could say, we're going to protect this way. And the Coastal Commission says, no, that will take away the beaches. Because there's one theory that to keep a beach, you've got to allow natural erosion, and that erosion will replenish the beach. But 90% of all the beaches here are supplied by sediments coming out of the bay. And what I would fear if the Coastal Commission could totally thwart something that we want, because they don't think that those kind of armoring protections are going to sustain enough of the beach. The issue, and I brought it up at another meeting, is the sediments coming out of the bay. We are in a sediment deficiency. That mining of gravel in the bay, dredging, dams, they have prevented the sediments to come and replenish. And they put up the seawall around San Francisco, where it's blocked from the dunes, but the beaches have grown since that time. They've grown almost over 100 years, just because there was enough supply of sediment. We're not getting that. And so my concern is if the Coastal Commission can override, just because their mission is a little different, and they're sort of operating on a very narrow theory of you have to have erosion to keep your beaches. Is there a way that we can offset that, or do they have the final decision on what we can do?
So I know that they have the final decision on the approval of the local coastal plan program update and the policies therein, but I can't speak on behalf of the Coastal Commission on what they ultimately approve or do not approve. And we had a representative here earlier for the technical work group, and she reiterated that these types of actions are always reviewed out on a case-by-case basis. And so that's all I can say for now, but you have many good points, and this is a complicated issue. So let's get into the.
I'm sorry, can I ask one question? You can put it in the parking lot if you want to. Maybe we should have a parking lot questions. But at some point, when will the conversation take place on the thresholds and what would trigger these things? I don't see anywhere in the plan, and like you say, you can hold that for later if you'd like, but I'd like to know that.
Cost benefits.
Right, so we are here today to look at the strategies that we put together and to get your input back on those so that we can finalize them and proceed with cost benefit analysis and proceed with scoping out these things with time, which relies on the types of triggers that you speak of. And those will be communicated in our next meeting when we have an actual draft of the adaptation plan. So that will, we're trying to get all of that put together for this next public workshop. And so we can have that will include discussion on what the triggers are, whether it's a flooding type trigger or erosion type trigger. So to narrow down the list of adaptation measures for each sub-area, we looked at, for each different sub-area, we looked at the list of measures, which are individual tools: placing rocks or rock revetment, development setbacks, transfer of development credits, beach nourishment. All of these are individual tools that we're calling measures. And so an adaptation strategy can include more than one measure. So we came up with adaptation strategies for each of the sub-areas in Pacifica based on a number of criteria that we discussed with the city. And these include on the slide here, does the measure protect existing development where there's existing development? Does the measure align with the community values? And those community values are what we understand from input throughout all the meetings that we've had, public comments, meetings with the working group so far. Does a particular measure seem to fit with the community values for a given sub-area? Also, an important factor is there the right amount of space or geographic morphologic conditions for this type of measure? At a steep eroding bluff, it may not have enough room to build a really large student system, but maybe dune nourishment or just beach nourishment would be suitable there. So general compatibility with the setting in each sub-area. Also, does the measure support or improve the existing recreational and ecological functions? And so both that and the existing development are two of the main community values, but we thought are important to distinguish them separately. So given all of these inputs from the public, comments that we've received, community values, existing development and recreational resources, available space, we went through all of the measures, and they're in a table in the memo, and listed the general pros and cons of each measure and whether it protects existing development, and then for each sub-area, rated it as general suitability, whether it's a positive fit for that sub-area, perhaps a neutral fit for a sub-area, or a negative fit, given those different factors that were discussed. And so this gave us a general picture of where the measures seem to fit with each sub-area so that we could start to put together our adaptation strategies. And so I would like to now go through the list of adaptation strategies that we've put together for each sub-area. Each alternative adaptation strategy may include more than one measure. Just to measure as a single tool, strategy is an approach that can be maintained through time that could include more than one measure. So let's.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Can you explain the bold, because it doesn't seem.
Oh yes, I'm sorry. That's a very good point. So bold strategies in this table were those that actually made it into strategies in more than one of the study. Yeah,
Not
more
whether
the.
there was a plus or not, because there were lots of them that had a plus, but they didn't wear bold.
Right. So the ones that are bold, the measures that are bold in this table appear in one or more strategies for the different sub-areas. Some of these other measures, like I said earlier, may not appear in a given strategy, but that does not to say that it is not adequate or not suitable for future consideration. We had to come up with a reasonable number of strategies, and so we couldn't include everything in a sense. So let's start with the Fairmont West sub-area. We're going to work our way from north to south and cover the 8 sub-areas and go through the alternative strategies that we've come up with. As you can see, for this Fairmont West sub-area, we're already considering retreat as a potential adaptation strategy for this area, given its setting. It is generally pretty open space. There's not much development on the bluff, and so there's room to allow natural erosion to occur and allow the beach to be maintained, at least in the near term. And so this is an area where retreat would look like allowing the bluff to erode in the near term, and at some point we would need to take actions to relocate the road and infrastructure, sewer infrastructure under the road out of harm's way under a full retreat scenario. Dan Ocampo of the Department of Public Works was here earlier, and he commented that road is a key, but really the only access point for that community straight into the rest of Pacifica. And so if we were to move that road, that would have implications for the community, that neighborhood. So we would need to think of some remedy for that access. We don't want to force everyone to drive up through Daly City. Perhaps there's a different alternative access route that could be created, another on-ramp to the highway in that neighborhood, or an underpass. So anyways, all of these strategies are going to have a number of secondary impacts and concerns. And so if there's something that is not mentioned or it comes to your guys' mind as a secondary impact, we would love to hear about that. Dan brought up that good point that we're going to need to have another access point for this neighborhood. And so those are things that we would include in the description, and so as to not seemingly forget about something important. In this area, we also have proposed as a second adaptation strategy, retreat with some protection as a hybrid, and that protection would take the form as beach nourishment in this area. And so by placing beach nourishments in the area, we could help to limit bluff erosion by adding a buffer, as well as to provide some recreational and ecological benefits with that beach nourishment. So that would delay the erosion and delay the time at which we would need to take action for that Palmetto Avenue and associated infrastructure. Also a measure in both of the retreat strategies is the transfer of development rights. So landowners in this sub-area could participate in a development rights transfer in order to recoup some of the value of their lands and to transfer development rights elsewhere that's out of the hazard zone. So that's another land use measure that's included in these strategies. This third strategy for this sub-area is kind of building off of the first two, allowing erosion and adding sand, but the third would be to then also introduce sand retention structures that would help to hold the sand that is nourished to that area for a longer period of time and provide more benefits to the back shore as well as to ecology and recreation. Are there any questions on the Fairmont sub-area? Yeah, Ron?
Yeah, I took a walk down there yesterday. We finally completed the new trail down to the beach, beach there. And it's an off-the-shore beach, so it's nice. Anyway, I was down there, and I walked down there many times before when it was still open, when it was open. I just noticed a lot of sand that comes down. Every day you walk down there, you'll see little sand piles that come, up above, top of the cliff. I'm just curious about it seems like it's almost nourishing itself the way all that's all that whole bluff is just sand. I'm just curious if that's something that's a positive thing for that area in terms of keeping the beach nourished. And I also just want to real quickly, it's kind of a little bit related in the sense that the way the new trail that they put in, they use a different strategy for protecting the bluffs that go down to the switchbacks. You got a series of switchbacks, and now the bluffs are covered with a thick layer of plastic with sandbags that are suspended from ropes, holding the plastic against the bluff. Whereas the last time they constructed that trail, they landscaped, they put jutes. Anyway, I'm just wondering if that's some kind of a strategy that can be used for protecting some of the bluffs that thick plastic with those sandbags suspended from ropes. Anyway, just my main thing was with the sand. I get a positive feeling that all of that erosion going on in the bluffs there, not that there's any structure that was helping nourish that beach.
Yeah, good point, Ron. The erosion of the bluffs, which are old uplifted marine deposits, do nourish the beach, and so that's why this area was identified as a good candidate for allowing erosion to occur to help maintain that beach area. I can't speak to the approach for managing erosion of the bluff face itself, but that's maybe they built that to withstand the runoff. Terrestrial erosion. Jim?
The third option, protect, for now says maintain all radial armor and armoring. I wondered about the practicality or the feasibility of trying to protect just a short beach when you are allowing erosion a beach to the north, if not more. It seems like that really works against that strategy.
Yeah, you're right. If it were to be outflanked on its side, this would be an issue. Yeah, but that is an area that's experiencing some erosion.
I mean, it does say also do beach nourishment, so I suppose if you nourish it up, what I'm worrying about doesn't happen, but I'll have questions later on the beach nourishment.
Right.
My concern is that large canyon that's opening up, is eroding deepest into the land. It looks like it's not an issue of sea level, but an issue of stormwater runoff.
Right.
Are people working it? That seems like what has to be protected to alter. That seems the biggest worry right there. Is the city working with that? Is there a combination of how you deal with this area with stormwater runoff versus whatever sea level erosion you're worried about?
Mm-hmm. Right, yeah, there's erosion occurring from both ends of the bluff, at the top and at the bottom. And that should, any plan developed for this area, I can't speak to the current efforts to manage that type of erosion, but it's definitely an issue in addition to for us. So I'm going to move on to the next sub-area. We're going to go down the road a little bit to the West Edgemar and Pacific Manor sub-area. And this sub-area includes the Ocean Air apartments down through the Manor area and Esplanade Avenue, some former and current apartment buildings, the shopping center, and the SF RV park. And so the area is mostly armored at this point. There are a couple of areas where there is no armoring, but let's just walk through the adaptation alternative, excuse me. So the first alternative strategy that we are considering here for the West Edgemar Pacific Manor area is to armor, and that it would involve armoring the current locations that are not armored along the, along Manor Drive between Manor or along Esplanade, between Manor Drive and Bill Drake. There's that open space there, and there's also a segment of the bluff that's not armored at the SFRV resort. So under the armoring scenario, we're assuming that armoring is expanded to cover the whole bluff toe, and this armor will be maintained as needed to remain effective through time. In addition to armoring, one of the things that's of value in all of Pacifica is the beach itself, and so without any, as much sand coming down from the bluffs or from littoral drift down the coast from San Francisco. And with sea level rise, these beaches will likely shrink and diminish if we have the whole thing armored and take no other action. So in order to provide that recreational benefit, ecological benefit, we're also looking at a strategy that follows the same approach for armoring, which is to keep everything armored and protected, but also to add beach nourishment to maintain that beach. It will not only provide recreational and ecological benefits, but will also provide an additional buffer to those armoring structures so that they experience less wave action and their maintenance requirements are less than the condition without the beach. So that's alternative 2. Alternative 3 is one step further, which is to add the sand retention structures that we've discussed in prior meetings, which could take the form of something like an offshore reef or a series of artificial headlands with stems, and that's the approach that we're currently looking at. But they generally have the same effect of helping to maintain a beach that we nourish for a longer period of time. And so that provides benefits, but it's also an added cost on constructing those structures. So the next alternative would be managed retreat and relocation of facilities in this sub-area, and that has been added here to the list, like I mentioned before, by the Coastal Commission's direction. And so they want us to include managed retreat for all of these areas in order to at least get a picture of what it's going to take, what it could potentially take to pull off something like that. And so I wanted to just reiterate here that that doesn't mean the city is pursuing or preferring to institute a managed retreat regime here, that this is an alternative that's being added to this cost-benefit analysis to satisfy the Coastal Commission's requirements.
Why the 2 threes?
No, that's a good point. The final number will be 3 for this sub-area, and so we need to decide
Why is that?
with just the limitations of our study, which basically gets to the beach nourishment with or without the sand retention structure. So those 2 scenarios are very similar.
To be.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's what. Sorry, I should have updated it to 4, but ideally we're going to be getting to a list of 3 for each area, and so we can include sand retention structures in the mid to long term as a part of a beach nourishment strategy, so that we can include both.
And again, you can put this in the parking lot if it makes sense not to answer right now. Purchasing property, where we all know that would be very expensive to do, are there any kind of programs that are being talked about, such as a person, it doesn't really seem to fall into the easement, but is there a potential for land trust or some sort of program where property owners for some type of benefit could give their property where their house has fallen off bail, or potentially, or do something for the future that would mitigate the costs of that?
Yeah, that's a great point, and I think that's kind of where we're all headed in California, to need to come up with some of these kinds of ways in which we can make managed retreat feasible. So to answer your question in short, I'm not aware of any existing programs, but I think that is something that the Coastal Commission, for one, would like to think more about, and by doing analyses like these to show what's the cost potentially for managed retreat, get the conversation going and get some minds at the table and start thinking about what kind of programs would make sense and could work. So you're looking ahead, and I think that's great.
Yeah, excuse me. Can you give me some more information about the context and substance of your telephone conversation with the Coastal Commission? When, with whom, and is it memorialized in any fashion?
So yes, we had a call with folks at the Coastal Commission, Kelsey Ducklow and one of her associates last week to review our list of adaptation strategies. And they had no comments on it other than that we needed to consider managed retreat. We thought that was somewhat expected, but it gives a suggestion of that importance to them that we consider managed retreat. And so they basically said, yes, we are requiring you to do managed retreat, and they're going to write up a formal letter to the city to memorialize it to address that part of your question.
Thank you.
Yeah, Jim?
Because the Coastal Commission can force us to consider managed retreat, one commitment I would want to see is when we're doing this cost-benefit analysis, the cost of adding nourishment could be mitigated by the Coastal Commission forcing any dredging in the bay that's robbing us of sediments to say, take your sediments and drop them here in Pacifica, so it's no cost to us. Is there a way we can get a commitment to kind of protect our beaches by making sure the sediments that are being robbed from us, that the Coastal Commission can make sure that we get them?
That would be a great funding mechanism, or alternative to having a funding mechanism. So I would appreciate that, an answer to that question, but I can't tell you what the Coastal Commission.
But I could say that if they say, well, we're not going to do that, we'd rather see you have managed retreat to save our beaches. That we're not playing on a level field that way, because we're losing sediments that could maintain the beaches. And if they're trying to make sure that is one of our missions, then they should kind of ensure that we're getting our appropriate allotment of natural sediment.
Yeah.
Is there a way we can push that to them?
That makes sense. I'm not aware of a way, but I'm not an expert on Coastal Commission workings. But I would think that they would be open to that conversation. So, and that's the type of discussion that we include in our adaptation plan as we go over the results and describe what managed retreat looks like in comparison to some of these other strategies like beach nourishment. So that's a good point.
I think that's a really provocative and interesting idea, but it isn't just Pacifica. There are other places that would want some sand, like North Beach and so on. So it gets complicated, but it's still a
Yeah, and then for the folks, and Jim, I know you were here, Jim, you were here. The previous public workshops that we heard from folks is the importance of having kind of a regional consideration to sea level rise adaptation. So I think that comment is certainly noted, and also just acknowledging the multi-jurisdictional issues that would be involved. There would be cities, there would be the Coastal Commission, but then the management of the bay as well. So I think that's a kind of a regional conversation which I think everyone is supporting. I don't know if that's within the scope of this document, but I think that to be effective, the regional, we're hearing that there's support for having regional conversations around solutions. So comments from
The literal component is really San Francisco, Daly City, and Pacifica, and the sediments seem to stop at Gateway Point. So it seems like it would just be those three groups that would have to deal with that. And the northern part of San Francisco Ocean Beach is gaining sediment, so they're getting enough. So it's really Daly City, maybe the very southern part of San Francisco, Daly City, and Pacifica that really needs that sediment. And that would be the regional. When you talk about region, you're talking about the literal compartment, right?
Well, I think I heard you mention the bay.
Well, the bay is, the sediments that come out of the bay are coming here.
Right, so the region kind of goes
They should
around.
just dump it outside the Golden Gate. where
Well, that's
it's
what
going.
they're doing, some of that now. So what I'm saying, they should dump it here in Pacifica.
All right, I'd like to move on to the next sub-area, which is just south of the RV Park at Northwest and Sharp Park sub-area. This sub-area has a lot of armoring as well, existing revetments and seawalls. And so, similar to the sub-area to the north, we're looking at a range of adaptation alternatives from armoring to maintaining existing armoring and beach nourishment to provide a home beach, as well as adding the sand retention structures. So this is following very much the same theme here as the northern sub-area, as will be for the sub-area south. And similarly, for areas in which we were not considering or preferring to look at managed retreat, where we've added it to the list now at the request direction requirement of the Coastal Commission. So pretty much the same suite of adaptation alternatives here. I don't think I need to get into the detail of each.
Does that include the area around Shoreview where the residents pay for their own?
Yeah, Shoreview is within Northwest Sharp Park, so.
So exactly, will they be still paying for their own, or will the city be helping? So it's about the area where, around Shoreview, where the residents are paying for their own, what that meant. So will they be still paying for that, or will the city be taking some responsibility?
I don't think that we're claiming what the city will pay for. I'll let Tina build that.
Right, so just to clarify that ultimately this adaptation plan will be a policy document for what the city believes is appropriate along our shoreline. And it's not, just because something's shown there along private property doesn't mean that the public will be paying for it. It just means that we have a policy now that if they want to go to the Coastal Commission and say replace or maintain their seawall, that they have this policy document that supports them.
What's the percentage of private funding of all these revetments, say from Edgemore down to Sharp Park?
That's a good question. I do not know.
Because number one says maintain existing public armor. I think most of it's private.
Yeah, good point. That was just an editing error on my behalf, but the strategy would be that all armor is maintained.
No, is there a hybrid between the public and private? The private sector is actually paying for some of our protection to our public infrastructure. So even though the policy is that they could go and ask for armoring, it seems like there should be a joint venture and not just have that protection be just the private citizens, because just behind them, and I know a number of Shoreview people have brought this up, that they're really protecting a lot of stuff that's behind them.
That's a good point.
Do we know where the infrastructure is? Is it along Shoreview Drive, or is it along, whatever it is, on the main street?
There's the road and there's utilities within that road as well.
Just serving that.
Serving the neighborhood. I can't speak to the system connectivity as far as stormwater or other conveyance. But I would imagine it's probably under Palmetto. But anyone can look at the web mapper on the city website and identify where all the assets are that we're considering. And so that includes the water, utilities, wastewater, and stormwater.
GIS.
Yeah, the GIS web mapper that we went over a couple meetings ago.
James, if I could just add, the utilities are in Shoreview. I'm not aware of any utilities that run along the backyards of those homes. There are some that come out on the edge of the neighborhood that the city has contributed to protecting those in the past. But I just wanted to report back that we did meet with the Shoreview neighborhood specifically because of their concerns that are very valid. And we did explain and go over in detail the issues concerning their neighborhood and what the city could and couldn't do with public funds and our understanding of grant funds and how they can be used.
Thank you for clarifying that. So I'd like to move a little further down now into the Sharp Park and West Fairway Park and Mori Point sub-area. So we've got a lot going on in this sub-area, a range of backshore types and levels of development. So for this area, similar to the rest of northern Pacifica, we're looking at a range of adaptation strategies that mostly include armor and also adding beach nourishment to that. So the armoring case, we're considering that the existing beach boulevard seawalls will be upgraded and maintained as needed to prevent erosion and flooding of the neighborhood. That includes wave overtopping, and that the seawall would be extended at Clarendon to close that gap as a part of the armoring strategy. We would then I think under the armoring case, we're just looking at armoring, but there's also the flood hazard to the adjacent neighborhoods around the Sharp Park Golf Course that are close to flooding under rainfall conditions. So SF, the city of SF owns the golf course and is in charge of that golf course and what happens on their berm. So we are not assuming any actions from San Francisco, other than that they would maintain that berm and continue the armoring along it to keep it in place. And so as a adaptation, part of the adaptation strategies for those inland low parts of the neighborhoods adjacent to the golf course, we are also considering building interior levees within the golf course with detention basins and little pumping stations on the upstream side of them, so that when runoff collects behind them, they can be pumped out to the beach, but that the function of those levees would be to protect the adjacent neighborhoods along Clarendon and I think Skyline, and at the lower portion of West Fairway Park, so that if there was a large fluvial event that flooded up the golf course, and it didn't really matter what SF ends up doing with their berms if we have those levees in place for those adjacent neighborhoods. So fortifying and raising that levee will provide some flood protection to the golf course from the coastal side, but there still remains the river flood source in that basin, which all used to be a big salt marsh. And so that's why we included that levee component for this sub area to help alleviate flooding risks for those adjacent neighborhoods.
I just had a question about horizontal levees. I see that it's not highlighted as one of the, can you explain why?
Right. So horizontal levees, if you were to compare a horizontal levee that functions the same as a traditional levee, you would have a traditional levee that takes up, 40 feet in width and may go up 10 feet. And an equivalent horizontal levee could be a smaller berm, but on the coastal or flood source side, we have a very gradual slope and would be vegetated with wetland and upland transitional plants to act as more of a buffer and reduce the height requirements of the actual levee that you have, but you do need a tremendous amount of space to construct those. And so in order to implement something like a horizontal levee around the perimeter of the golf course, that would require sacrificing a lot of the golf course. And since the city does not have any say in what the city of San Francisco will do with that golf course, that was not deemed an appropriate thing to consider. It could be looked at in further studies and would likely be a suitable solution, but that's dependent on compliance and coordination with the city of San Francisco. Similarly, the berm on the beach could be set back at a certain distance, and the same kind of horizontal levee concept could be used on the beach side, and instead of using vegetation of wetland species, you could create a horizontal levee that's comprised of dune vegetation. But again, this one parcel is owned by the city of San Francisco, and so we're not prescribing any adaptations to strategies to this particular area. So
if the state, if Coastal Commission's a state entity, I don't understand why they wouldn't have jurisdiction over being able to say that the city of San Francisco needs to work with the city of Pacifica to make sure that we have a plan that works together there. Shouldn't we at least make that to say, hey, Coastal Commission, we really need you guys to force San Francisco to work with us? Right? I mean, should we make that statement or something like that and make sure that we're aligned?
Yeah, I think it's definitely worth pointing out, and it speaks to some of the other comments that we've had. It's taking things at a more regional approach. This is a more geographically focused manifestation of that, but it's a big problem, and it requires regional solutions and regional collaboration. And I agree that the city of Pacifica and San Francisco should be more coordinated on the types of issues that the current setup causes for the community of Pacifica, and perhaps making this interior levy concept happen that I just proposed would be an opportunity for San Francisco to oblige the city of Pacifica and say, hey, yes, this makes sense. We'll allow you a certain easement to construct these levees and detention basins so that at least your neighborhoods are protected while we continue to manage the golf course how they choose to do so. But your point to request the Coastal Commission to provide some more direction on this, I think is a good point, and we could include something like that in the plan to highlight that issue.
Having lived in that neighborhood for 40 years, my observation is when there's flooding around the golf course area, it comes from periods of heavy rain like we had last year. But the flooding happens when our drainage is not draining, and a lot of the water is coming from Highway or Highway 1 or somewhere above, higher than we are, because we're below sea level at the golf course and the neighborhood around it, at least 5 feet below sea level. So that water that's pooling up around the 7-Eleven, around Lakeside, all of that's not coming from the ocean. That's our rainwater.
Right,
It's
yes.
coming in. So how does building those berms around the side of the golf course prevent flooding the neighborhood when the water is not coming from the golf course?
So
Or the ocean?
Yeah, I agree with you that the water's not just coming from the ocean. There's the fluvial flood source. And so what these levees would entail would have sort of a detention basin on the landward side of the levee that would collect what's immediately coming in from that neighborhood area. And similarly to how they have portable pump stations out there in periods of rain and are pumping, you see there's a little white pipe along Fairmont that goes out to the beach, and they're already doing something like that. There's just not a levee. Yeah, so it would basically to formalize that approach along Fairmont and do a similar thing for the West Fairway Park portion, lower portion that's next to the neighborhood. And so what does run off from those neighborhoods and would pile up behind these levees because they're restricting any overland flow would be managed with a little basin and pump station at each of the 2 spots where we would put the levees. There's also a lot more runoff that would be coming from upstream and from other avenues off the highway or upstream on Sanchez Creek that does drain into the golf course. So the floods that do pile up within the golf course would also be managed by those
Because Highway 1
levees.
is elevated and East Sharp Park is elevated, so everything was coming from the east, flowing our direction to the west. And then one comment I wanted to make, because I have attended Coastal Commission meeting last year. San Francisco is, as much as they can be within the context that they're a permit cooperative with the neighborhood, because they did argue, and many of the neighbors showed up and argued in favor of maintaining the levee to protect the neighborhood from flooding. So there is a very strong element of cooperation with San Francisco, and I don't want to leave this meeting anyone thinking there isn't. Just what you're stating is something that should be looked at in the future, and I agree. But there has been a great level of cooperation with San Francisco in terms of what they're doing for the golf course and improving the environment of the golf course, not only for the critters that are out there, but for us that live next door. So I just wanted to state that. Thank you.
Yeah, I just had a question about, is it true that the sand kind of moves out of the bay and comes down and kind of catches a bit at Mori Point? Does sand travel and it accumulates? Because that beach is so high, it's just, and everything else is going lower, just north of it, and it's catching that sand. And I'm just wondering, does that offer any opportunities for protection, or is there some solution that utilizes that, or would it be useful to reduce some of that sediment? I just don't know the engineering aspect of it. But
Yeah, so the headland net functions as a barrier for offshore sediment transport. And as you can see by looking on the maps, that the beach is widest along North Pacifica, right at the headland, and it's even angled a little bit to the north, showing its tendency to accumulate there. And we're, as part of the adaptation strategies that include these sand retention structures, the type of sand retention structure that we proposed for that option is to mimic the effect that Mori Point has by creating some artificial headlands with reefs out at the end and some jetties connecting back to the shore that would create some more smaller cells that look like the south end at Mori Point right there.
Lateral jetties coming on.
Yeah, perpendicular to the shore coming out, and those would be then nourished with sand, and having those sand protection structures in place would help to keep that sand nourishment keep it around longer, and so reduce the requirements.
And maybe help some of the properties from losing, having everything.
Julie, can you use your microphone?
It would help the properties further north from having so much sand sucked away. It's kind of, its movement was interrupted.
Battalion called it a groin, a natural groin, a groin point, that's correct, was that?
Yeah, jetties and groins, the terms are interchangeable, but yeah, the effect is that it's a sand, a sand barrier, sand movement barrier, and so just building them is not enough. There's not enough sand coming into the system, and there's also there's been conversation on the effects of these types of structures on down coast transport. But as a part of this, we're making a assessment of sediment transport in this area to help influence or to help inform our shoreline modeling, and that tracks the shoreline erosion and tells us when we should trigger a beach nourishment, for example. But the effect of having those headland structures with beach nourishments is that the sand would be held for a longer period of time, as opposed to just washing down the coast, piling up slightly at Mori Point, or otherwise being washed offshore.
Nice follow on. But over time, what's happened is that, because the golf course used to be at the same level as the beach, if I look at the older photographs, wasn't it? It didn't require a big berm, and the sand wasn't right just below that big berm. There was no berm.
There's a lot of buildup.
Yeah, so it's like the strategy has been to just find a way to collect it and to keep it from going inland, but I don't know, I have questions about that, but I'll leave it to the answer.
Okay, let's get Cindy's question. It's about 7:15, and I think we have 4 or 5 more of these to go through. So just want to make sure we get through this.
I just wanted to have clarified, is an artificial headland really just a jetty or a groin, and that's a new name for it, or?
Yeah,
Okay.
it's a jetty, yeah,
Okay. So
with
that-
a reef at the end.
All right, so just it has a head to it, but it's basically a jetty.
Yes.
Or a groin. And then it has to be then, in order to make sense, it has to be complemented, as you said, with also beach nourishment. They can't live just on their own, so.
Yeah, given the sand supply in this area, we would expect that just building a series of jetties would be sufficient to maintain
Because
the
it
beach.
just does impact the down coast. Okay, thank you.
Follow up to that. I want to point out that the headland, which is this natural groin, extends way out away from shore. So you get a barrier effect which extends way farther than anything you would build if you put in a man-made groin, which was at 200 feet at the most, and then it kind of stops. So it's not why we can use the same terminology for them. They aren't going to function the same way because the geology extends offshore in a way that we can't reproduce engineering-wise. I guess I should say, isn't that right? Or is that, do I have that wrong?
Yeah, with enough money, we might be able to get close, but that's another issue. So, if there are no more questions on this sub-area, I'd like to move around the headland, so to speak, to Rockaway. And here we've got Rockaway sub-area that includes the cove, the quarry, and the headlands. And so here, because again, we've got a sub-area with a good range of backshore types, our measures or our strategies are more of a hybrid based on the level of development in this sub-area. So first off, we have a protect and accommodate hybrid strategy, which includes armoring, managed realignment, and development setbacks. And so what this would look like is armoring, maintaining the existing armor that protects the facilities down the hotel and other infrastructure down on the coast. And that armor would be maintained and upgraded through time to limit erosion and wave overtopping hazards. While at the south end of the beach, we have a more natural shore, and we could allow the natural erosion processes to occur down here, and could relocate the bathroom and parking facilities that are in that area in order to maintain the beach. At a certain point, erosion may impact the embankment of Highway 1, and so under this scenario, we would assume that that embankment is armored, and that becomes an issue because it's an important corridor for transport for the region, not just Pacifica. In the areas that are not developed, we would use land use measures such as development setbacks in the quarry to make sure that any new development is located far enough from the coast that it is not an issue for the life of that structure. So that's a land use measure that makes sense in areas that aren't developed. So we're using it here as a part of each strategy. Next on the list for this is another iteration of the protect accommodate hybrid, but with the addition of beach nourishment. So everything would look the same. We would be maintaining the armoring and using development setbacks for the quarry area, but also add beach nourishment to help also, not just maintain the beach, but again, to reduce the maintenance requirements on the existing armoring structures there. And so as to also limit the erosion at the southern part of the cove. The third alternative would be to add, in addition to beach nourishment, sand retention structure. So that could be an offshore reef. This area, I think we're leaning towards just the beach nourishment portion, so that to make our final three, because this cove is pretty contained, pretty self-contained, and beach nourishment, it would be more of a successful approach just in general in the cove. And then last, at the direction of the Coastal Commission, we also have managed retreat in this area, and so that would include removing the armoring and facilities and allowing erosion to proceed. And so we would look at this to satisfy the Coastal Commission's requirements.
Sorry, quick question.
Jim.
Great. So in pages 15, 16, 17, 18, and coming up to 21, in that last option, you say, remove existing armoring structures and allow erosion. I guess you don't want to leave the riprap or stuff there, but in terms of sort of the timing of everything, it seems to rip it out rather than taking advantage of the time that you have while it still provides some protection to do the transition would make so much more sense. Is the prohibition against letting that stuff stay there until it's no longer effective? You have to physically pay for removing it?
So that's a good point. The timing of this retreat alternative still needs to be worked out, but I think a reasonable thing to assume here. And again, this is not to overly plan the option of managed retreat, but we could say that managed retreat occurs or begins in 20 years or something to allow time for the planning to go through, acquisitions of property that are needed. This is a whole can of worms that we're not getting into, but we're trying to adequately represent in our analysis so that we have a ballpark picture on how it compares with other alternatives. These are a lot of great, issues that need to be worked out, and there's a great lack of guidance from the state level on how we are actually supposed to do that. So these are great questions, and so we need to perhaps, in our looking at this, we can bring up some of these issues and perhaps start a larger conversation for the greater development.
Just as a follow-up to that, I think Tina had mentioned earlier that it's cheaper to plan ahead if that were to happen than to actually clean it up when it happens. So maybe removing it would be cheaper.
Mm-hmm.
I want to point out, just for the sake of
Right there. Just for the sake, some of the people are fairly new in the Pacific area, but the armoring, the revetment armoring in front of the Seabreeze Hotel is first, earliest, and oldest of that type of protection system here in the Pacific. And so much so that there's mussels and barnacles and all kinds of marine vegetation growing on the rocks. But I think it's interesting. It's an interesting area to observe how it looks to the south of that, where there's no full armoring, and how much that, it has protected that part for 60s or more years, 70 years. So it's interesting to observe that going.
Any other questions for the Rockaway sub-area?
Yeah.
Sam?
I made this point earlier, but I think we're doing a little bit of a disservice to the Manager Creek portion and all these in some of these sections, because of the fact that one of the things that we're not considering, I know we talked about this, but I wanted to make sure that for the community group, they hear this as well, is that some of the state guidance is to consider currently undeveloped open space where there's nothing on there right now as part of your plan to either take on storm surge or manage retreat. So the golf course, again, I'm not saying give up on the golf course, but when there's storm surge, that we temporarily are able to direct water there versus into the neighborhoods. The same here with the quarry, instead of the water trying to force its way into the Rockaway neighborhood there, that we are able to divert the water into the quarry area instead. And then we're going to go towards the south on this, but also the same thing for Federal Point, where there's a 5-acre field there that's below sea level, that again, instead of considering that we potentially can flood the shopping center in Lindemar or the Federal Point shopping center as well, that we're able to direct the water to that open space there, and we're not having to give up anything. It's already open space.
Thanks for that, and thanks for repeating it for all the community work here.
It's not open space.
Here.
It's not open space, it's private property.
It's private property, but there's nothing on, there's no development on it. Sorry, I
It's almost like
misspoke.
somebody
There's
just
no
wants
development
somebody
on it.
to take away some of the private property rights.
No, it's not right. You buy things.
So yeah, we're not getting into the level of saying we're taking all open space. There would need to be mechanisms to properly exchange the property so that it can be conserved and go to the
It's the
property.
same thing, it goes with purchased property, it's the same thing. It's coming to an agreement as to what that property is worth, right? And being able to move that, I'm not saying that it's just like, hey, obviously, it's, and domain works in different ways, but anyway.
And just one thing, because it ties into all of this, which as Jim pointed out, was on all of these past slides and future ones. So, and I know that this was just added on based on the call for retreat. So these are being reshuffled and relooked at, because isn't there a hybrid option with that? I think maybe to Sam's point, there's not been, enough of hybrid options with putting in accommodations and hybrids on retreat in what we have right now.
Yeah, so our first adaptation alternative for the Rockaway Quarry, which we came up with before the Coastal Commission had us categorically add retreat, which is a hybrid some protect, accommodate, and retreat. And so there are some areas where we do have a good, good opportunity to analyze a hybrid.
Maybe Sharp Park could have had more.
Yeah, and so, and while we're looking, we're looking at all these alternatives and coming up with what are some good these are all kind of case studies to look at. And then review after we analyze the how the physics change and the hazards change and what the economic impacts and implications are for all of these. We then get to the actual point of what should our adaptation plan be. And so that could be a hybrid, its own, next step of a hybrid approach. And not just locationally, while we armor here and a retreat right next door, it could be a thing through time, while the city will encourage or facilitate the maintenance of existing structures for the foreseeable future. At a certain point, there may be a switch that we need to make, and that's like another form of hybrid, sort of the time-based hybrid. So, yeah, I agree. There's never going to be one solution that works. It's all going to have to be a hybrid of some kind, and that's going to be articulated as we get through this process and develop the adaptation plan. So I'd like to move on around the Edland again to Pacifica State Beach. This sub-area is it's close to it. We're actually sitting in the West Fairmont sub-area, but we're right next to the Pacifica State Beach sub-area. And this sub-area has got a lot of great beach ecology right now. There's a great dune system that's been maintained by a lot of folks in Pacifica. And so we identified this as an area that had some more room for allowing erosion or retreating due to the limited resources and the configuration of this coastline. So I'd like to first start with the protect adaptation alternative that we're proposing here. And so that alternative includes the maintenance and upgrade of armoring that's protecting some parking and a pump station and bathroom, multiple pump stations and bathroom here. There's also more parking that's currently unarmored with additional pump stations. So under the armoring scenario, we would be maintaining the existing armor and building new armor as needed to protect those existing facilities. And that would also include floodproofing the pump stations in place, because they're at least the northern pump station protrudes a little bit more. So armoring that in a way that it would also be floodproof for coastal storm events. And as part of that, this strategy, we would also allow the shoreline to retreat in the northern part of Pacifica State Beach more naturally, erosion to proceed into the dunes. And at a point in which the highway would be impacted, we are assuming that the highway would be raised and armored to counteract erosion as well as wave overtopping for much greater amounts of sea level rise in the future. And we don't claim to have any funding mechanisms in place or that the Caltrans has promised to do this. Just a disclaimer there that goes for all of these strategies.
So clarification on the raising the highway, does that actually mean that will be sort of part of the levee system? So it's raised that way, or is actually, are you putting it on poles or whatever, so the water goes underneath it or sand?
Under the protect approach, it would be the former, a levee to prevent wave action from making its way into west of the Thank you for clarifying. The next strategy for Pacifica State Beach is a retreat hybrid approach, which includes some of the same stuff from the first option, but essentially we are going to allow erosion to occur and at that point remove the parking lot, and the pump stations would have to be relocated, but erosion would be held at the highway, and similarly the highway would be raised and armored when the erosion gets back to that point. So that is another option. And then the third option for this area would be to add beach nourishment to this suite of allowing natural processes to occur and maintaining existing armor so that a wider beach and dune restoration could help to provide more buffer for those facilities that exist and also provide the recreational and ecological benefits associated with a beach ecology and dune system.
The work they did at that beach, was there nourishment done at that time?
I do not know if there was a substantial nourishment. I know that they reconfigured the parking lot.
Here's something that we need to consider though, is when the.
Sam, you got a microphone, right?
Okay, I'm pretty loud anyway, but, when they did the bridge project here, Caltrans did, they actually trucked out about 100 truckloads of sediment out of that creek and took it somewhere else. So again, if we're considering these things, that I know they're gonna have to dredge that again soon because it's raising again. And we need to be able to put some safeguards in there to say, you know, don't take 100 truckloads of sediment away from us, sand, and dump it in the beach, right? Is there a way for us to be able to force that issue?
So yeah, that's a good point, and these types of directives could be a part of an opportunistic beach nourishment program for the city, in which there's a program put in place to identify sources, like sediment sources in the area, and kind of ahead of time pre-approve them for nourishment, or somehow alleviate some of the hurdles that are need to be overcome to do things like beach nourishment. Monterey Bay is working, the city of Monterey is working on a regional opportunistic beach nourishment program down there. And it's exactly that, identifying where there are the projects in which good beach sand sediments are being generated and would otherwise be hauled off to the dump or otherwise disposed of out of the region, and redirecting that to beneficial reuse on the beach. So that's something that is definitely going to be more and more relevant up and down the coast, including Pacifica. But as far as including that type of program, that's not within this LCP update process, but it is something that we can identify.
Jim, hold on.
Something that we wouldn't like develop it, but we would say this is something that we need to help meet the need for sand. Sorry, I didn't mean to say that we're not going to mention it.
To respond to Jim's question regarding nourishment of Lindenmar Beach, at that time when Lindenmar Beach was being redone, there was a great deal of sand brought in after the houses were taken out, and the sand was put down in the section of the beach just north of where the creek comes in. So that area where all those houses were moved, that was a lot of sand was brought in. At the time I knew Jim, and Jim really was spearheading on that, and also Scott Holmes was at the time the city, and Scott was in charge of the project. And when they brought all that sand in, I remember him talking about how hard it was to find the right sand to bring in that matched our sand. So at that time, it was a big consideration of what the sand looked like. And I don't, to talk to Sam's question about bringing stuff in, I don't know how much of a consideration it would be currently for you, what it looked like, but at the time, matching sand was kind of a tricky thing. So I just wanted to bring that comment in.
Yeah, my question is, since you've done all this work, ESA did all this work, right, on Lindenmar Beach?
That was before my time, but yes, time PWA, ESA.
Do we have measurements of how the width of the beach has changed? And do you usually measure from low tide? See for the width?
So we would, in a lot of these shoreline studies, we look at the high tide line to measure the beach width. And so that's done because it's a easy thing to see in aerial imagery, but it's often, the wet dry line is pretty close to the high tide line where the groundwater is seeping out from the sand on the beach. So in exercises where we're looking back through a lot of old imagery and we don't have an actual terrain model to extract the contour on. We'll use that wet dry line as a surrogate for the beach, or the shoreline, and how we would track the shoreline movement. So as far as how much we've monitored at Pacifica since it was constructed, I'm not sure how many surveys we've conducted, but we do have estimates from the USGS on historic erosion rates there, and that would be considered in our shoreline evolution modeling in order to trigger how much beach nourishment.
How much is the beach eroded from the USGS?
I can't tell you off the top of my head, but I could point you to the right source that could determine that.
So Jim, let's get your comment and then let's keep moving.
I just thought it would be very smart to put a couple of these policy recommendations like cooperation with the city, those things that we think could really make a difference in the long term. There should be a sentence or two about that in this update, even though it's not. I don't think they would make you throw it out. It seems like a really good idea.
Yeah, certainly, certainly, and a lot of these ideas, this is why we have these meetings to get more ideas and these types of considerations that we should fold into the document, whether or not it's driving an aspect of the document. Hey, these are things that have been suggested or identified as ways to facilitate things, beach nourishment, for example, or other funding mechanisms that could be thought of. So definitely well taken, all of these ones. So I wanted to reiterate that because it's good feedback, so I appreciate that. I think that we covered the Pacific State Beach. So let's move on to the West Lindenmar area. Just inland from Pacifica State Beach, West Lindenmar area may not be technically in the coastal zone, but is influenced by the coastal proximity, and it will be more of a it'll be potentially more impacted by coastal flooding in the future with sea level rise. So we've included this sub-area in the study because it is important to us that we are including all the potential impacts that sea level rise may have. So I want to point that out here in Lindenmar. It's a pretty low neighborhood. It used to be a salt marsh, and so the first issue that sea level rise will have in this neighborhood is the issue of groundwater. There are a couple of patches of wetland just within a stone's throw from here that are an indication of that high groundwater level, and so as sea level rises, the groundwater will also be expected to rise at a similar rate. And so we're going to need to take some steps to manage that elevated groundwater. And so the first accommodate or protect strategy we proposed for West Lindenmar is to install a subdrain and pump station system to manage those rising groundwater levels so that it is managed into the future with higher sea levels. And similarly, the actions taken on Highway 1 will affect the coastal flooding potential of that West Lindenmar area as well. So by raising and armoring the Highway 1, we can mitigate or prevent and manage the potential coastal storm impacts of wave overtopping over the highway. The dunes are a good protection right now. They're pretty well higher than the existing highway, as you can see as you drive along there. But if those dunes were to erode back and over time and there to be a storm, there's some great flood potential into that neighborhood. And the USGS Cosmos coastal flooding shows that at higher sea level rise amounts. So that's why the raising the highway is an important piece of both of these sub areas.
How high will it go up? How high would you raise it?
That's a good question. I think guessing offhand maybe 10 feet for this study to get us through 2100. I'm just spitballing here. Sitting in my car and driving by the highway, it seems like the dunes are maybe 10 or so feet higher than the highway. So raising it up at that level, I think could be a reasonable thing to, as far as this study level analysis. So about 10 feet or so, I'm guessing, but at any rate. The next strategy in Lindenmar is more of a protect approach. The neighborhood is within the floodplain. the 100-year floodplain for San Pedro Creek. That's an existing flood source for the neighborhood. And so with rising sea levels, that flooding will, is expected to worsen as the sea level itself is a boundary condition for that creek. And if the boundary that it's draining into is raising up, the floodwaters will raise accordingly upstream. So as a way to mitigate that risk, we're proposing as a part of the second strategy to build a flood wall along the commercial area near the shopping center to limit the flooding connectivity of the creek into this area. And this strategy also includes the raising of Highway 1 to limit the coastal flooding source into the area as well. And also includes that groundwater management measure of installing a subdrain and pump station to manage the rising groundwater levels. So
Real another comment on that. I think we just have to be careful with saying building a levee or flood wall there. There's at least 2 protected species in there. So all of a sudden building a flood wall or something, some kind of, I'm envisioning, just the LA River or something like that. And that's not going to bode well for the steelhead or the frog hanging out there. So I'm not sure that the Coastal Commission would approve something like that.
yeah, I think the type of flood wall that we would, that are thinking of in this case isn't a big extensive levee type thing. It would be more of an engineered concrete and steel feature that could be built along the periphery of the existing development. We're not proposing, encroaching into the stream wetland itself. So the next potential adaptation strategy for West Linamar is to accommodate by way of elevating structures in that neighborhood. And so that would essentially, by allowing the structures to be raised, you could remove them from the flood source, the floodplain of San Pedro Creek. And so lowest portions of the neighborhood, we could identify when, at what point that those structures would need to be raised to remove them from the flooding hazard of the creek. And this strategy also includes the groundwater management for day-to-day water levels in the neighborhood.
So you wouldn't purchase some of those houses if it would be too costly?
I would think it'd be pretty costly, raising all those houses. It would be easier just to purchase them. But if you raise it, I would think that would be a better route to go for houses on stilts. That's my view.
So we'll be able to tell you a more informed response to that question, Ron, when we look at retreat strategy in this neighborhood, which would, instead of raising structures that are in those flood zones, we would restore them to wetlands. So that's how we would consider a retreat strategy in the neighborhood.
Getting rid of them?
Right, raising, not with a Z, but with an S.
Elevating like the bridge or like the highway.
Yeah, so what I mean by raising is actually elevating the structures above the floodplain for the accommodate strategy. And the retreat strategy in this area would be to restore homes that are in the rising groundwater levels, or within the area that are influenced by rising groundwater, getting those properties and converting them back to wetland. Jim?
2 questions. One I would expect that the Linamar area, since we lost Lake Matilda and it used to be a floodplain, that the land has subsided, which is typical. So I don't know, do we have measurements of how the land has changed? And 2, are there wells in there so we can monitor how groundwater is? I know when we've done our restoration work in Sierras, we put in a number of wells and we monitor how quickly the groundwater rises. I feel like we're talking hypothetical, and I don't hear that there's measurements to guide us when to trigger these kind of adaptations.
Right, that's a very good point. And I don't know what the land motions have been doing in the neighborhood, and I don't know if there are any monitoring wells. But if we were to look at this strategy, it rises to the top as the most preferable, then we would, in the adaptation plan, provide recommendations such as installing monitoring wells to monitor the groundwater levels to help us to decide when we need to take intervention and start to manage or take some adaptation measures and actually implement them. So this is assuming that we would just do it with time, given the actual hazard data that we have and what are the costs and benefits with that. Once we sort through all the costs and benefits and decide what are our good options, what are some combinations that we can come up with, we'll develop guidelines and things that should be done to monitor the conditions like groundwater or shoreline erosion or bluff erosion, and when action should be taken. So yeah, that's a good point. That would be a part of the adaptation plan to add measurements. I think Rob.
Pertaining to Lindmore, because you're talking about water and all that, we got a lot of water going on in Sharp Park too. But in Lindmore, I don't know if you maybe not this, but maybe how did all that good work that was done with the flood control project for San Pedro Creek, and then the work that was done by the bridge and the dredging that Sam was talking about, how did all that perform with all those rains that we had last year? How was the flooding? Was there an issue? I know we had a problem in Sharp Park. You guys worked on it really hard with our water problems, but how was it down there?
So in the area of the flood control project, so it didn't do the entire creek, but just certain areas of the creek. I am not aware, and I'm not in the engineering department, but I am not aware of a problem that we had.
So there was no flooding, no backing up, no flooding like we.
In the specific project area.
All right, so Lindmore did well with all that water. Sounds like they did better than we did. Thank you.
We could just follow on some of this discussion. I'm wondering whether to say this or when. I think some of us may be, it seems important to me that we're talking about scenarios that are going to play out over 50 to 100 years, or 30 to 70 years. And the concept of elevating some houses or even buying some houses out that are in severe danger, it's spread out over a long period of time. And you also have a lot of municipal opportunities for providing tax incentives, for subsidies, getting grants for subsidies, which then can be used over timescales that most of us are not used to considering. But 50 years to buy out a house or two a year, or give somebody a subsidy to elevate their house in a danger zone, seems to me to make some of these things seem much more feasible than say, oh my God, all of West Sharp Park is going to buy them out? That's not that's not how it probably play out. I wonder.
But if I live in a neighborhood that's maybe my house is just 2 or 3 blocks away from those identified properties, that's going to affect my ability to buy insurance in the future and my property value. With a lot of other things going on with me and my neighbors and where we live. Once that's identified.
Yeah, I gotta do a time check. It's about 10 till, so I want to make sure we have time for public comment. So.
All right, are there any other comments on West Lindmore? We've got one more sub area. All right. Pedro Point and Shelter Cove sub area. So this sub area includes the Pedro Point neighborhood, the currently undeveloped field, some homes along the waterfront on the Pacifica State Beach side next to the creek, the shopping center along the creek, and Shelter Cove. So our strategies that we're looking at here for Pedro Point, one is to protect, which would be to assume that the existing armoring protecting those private homes are maintained and expanded along the rest of the shorefront there that's not currently armored, as well as to armor the toe of the headland to limit erosion of the headland there. And similarly to the way that we're dealing with Sharp Park golf course, we're not proposing any adaptation alternatives on this single parcel that is Shelter Cove. So these actions that I'm talking about really focus on the Pacifica state beach side of the headland here. So protect is one option, we're gonna honor that. The second option is to protect with some beach nourishment, as well as having the ability to raise those homes on the beach side to remove them from the coastal floodplain. And again, we're not considering any actions for shelter code because it's the entire parcel, single parcel. And the beach nourishment would really be affecting the area closest to the creek mouth and in conjunction with the Pacifica State Beach nourishments. And we're not saying that we're going to nourish the steeper headland portion. It would just be into the lower beach area. And so the third option here for the direction of the Coastal Commission would be manage retreat. So that would entail, at a certain time, removing the existing structures and allowing erosion to proceed and pulling back from the bluff edge there. So we would be including that at the request direction of the Coastal Commission.
Again, my comment here is that we have currently undeveloped 5-acre field that should be considered as part of the action treaty.
Thanks, Sam. So those are our alternatives that we have put together here today. And so what are the next steps? So here in the next few days, we're going to finalize what those 3 adaptation alternatives will look like for each of the sub areas. And we'll get into the stage of performing our cost-benefit analysis of these alternatives. And so that includes a number of things. The first being determining what's going on the shore and how that changes things like recreation ecology and the hazards themselves. So I'll be doing a shoreline change analysis to track the beach width through time, and that includes erosion and movement of the shoreline with sea level rise, as well as erosion of the back shore if it's allowed for a given alternative. And with that, we can time our certain actions based on triggers of allowable beach width. For example, a stable beach width will indicate when we need to add a beach nourishment. So that will help us to schedule these alternatives into the future, considering the sea level rise scenario that we're looking at. As we're able to time out these alternatives, as I'm looking at beach nourishment, we're also looking at armoring in a lot of locations. So tracking the beach width, and that's in this shoreline change analysis will also tell us when armoring needs to be constructed and or when armoring should be maintained, upgraded, etc. So timing out all these actions will allow us to come up with a cost through time of each strategy from the engineering perspective. It'll also give us recreational and ecological outputs for that beach function, and that will go into the economic analysis. I'll also then go into a process of creating modified hazard maps that represent the different adaptation strategies. So if we're going to be raising the highway right here to prevent flooding of West Lindemar, the new flooding hazard zone with 5.7 feet of sea level rise wouldn't include the West Lindemar area anymore because we've applied that adaptation strategy. So I'll come up with new hazard zones to represent all these adaptation strategies, and then go through the same process that we did with the vulnerability assessment of overlaying the new hazards for the different strategies with all the assets that we have identified and valued, and to come up with a long list of impacts for each of these strategies. And so those numbers I will then hand over to our economist, and he'll do the cost-benefit analysis, comparing the costs to implement these measures or implement these strategies and the benefits that they yield by both providing a beach or limiting flooding or limiting erosion. And so then we'll have a good picture of what these strategies look like on paper with respect to cost and benefit, and they will be included into our adaptation plan. So we'll look at these at the next meeting at the June 23rd public workshop, and work with the city to come up with a preferred sort of guide of or what we're calling the adaptation plan, and what we should plan to do, and that will have some flexibility, have some preferences, will be different from sub-area to sub-area, and so we'll all be reviewing that on June 23rd. And then after we get the adaptation plan together, we'll be looking at what are the policies that we need to come up with to implement or encourage, what's the word I'm looking for, encourage or enable these kinds of adaptation strategies to take place in the city. And that will be reviewed at our next round of working group meetings and subsequent public workshop.
Does either the ecological or the economical modeling that you're doing and providing, does it include what the impact on greenhouse gases is of these different potential solutions? Trucking in tons of boulders or moving sand and concrete?
No, it does not, but that would be, the next will be a part of like the environmental assessment of some of these types of actions, but it's something to consider for sure. Where are we getting the rocks and sand from?
Or demolishing houses.
Demolishing houses. That is included, the purchase and, relocation or demolishing of facilities. That is included, but not greenhouse gases. That would be beyond the scope of this kind of work.
I just want to make sure I understand. So, like the three A and B different alternatives you've selected for each sub area, are those kind of set, like they make sense together, like everything in one makes sense to keep this one, or is there a chance that we could potentially take some of 1 and 2 and that's what we come up with?
Yeah, so the alternatives have been refined and defined to a reasonable degree so that we can take a look at the impacts and benefits of each. But when we get to the adaptation plan, it may come up in some areas that a couple of these options may look very similar and provide a similar level of protection, similar benefits. In that case, that would be a great opportunity to kind of blend or allow the blending of different measures that are included in each. So it's not to say that if option 1 is the best as far as our analysis, that it's going to be the one that we pursue. It's going, there's a lot of factors that are at play here, and we can't include everything in the study, so there's obviously going to be some uncertainties, but getting a good picture of what types of actions cost more, what types of actions provide more benefit, we'll be able to inform what our adaptation plan looks like for each sub-area. So we're not restricting by any means by having our alternatives defined in this way.
I'm curious of your trigger points. If I look at the San Francisco package, it hasn't been rising more than 1 millimeter a year for the last 30 years. So that means in 25 years we go to only rise by 1 inch. If that remains the case, a lot of these adaptations we might not have to do in most places, but perhaps we're down to the Fairmont sub area where it's such fragile soil that's easily eroded. There's a place where you'd have to trigger something no matter what sea level does. Do we have trigger points in place that you're looking at?
So yeah, we would want to sea level rise for things like coastal flood exposure. The amount of sea level rise that occurs while a coastal storm today doesn't impact the West Lindenmar neighborhood. It could if we get to 5 feet of sea level rise. So that would be an instance where the sea level rise amount is a trigger point. In the case of erosion,
I was looking a little more specific. I know hypothetically if it gets higher, then we have to do something. But I also know Scripps just released a study that the storm surge really hasn't changed since 1940. So we really don't have a threat there. Occasionally we might get big storms and storm surge and El Niños, but we're going to always get those. But specifically, when would we start feeling we have to raise the highway? Do you have a point on that?
That would be dependent on the erosion occurring in the beach. So if we get to within a storm damage threshold, meaning, I don't know what it is off the top of my head, but let's say if the potential storm erosion in Pacifica can be 8 feet during a given storm. So if the beach width in front of the highway is less than 80 feet, we need to take action. Either we need to add a beach nourishment to move that beach out to replenish that buffer, or we need to take action to grade the highway in preparation of potential impacts if there are, for example, no sand available to do the nourishment.
So to Jim's point, will those specific thresholds be identified?
Yes, yeah.
So you'll see that.
We'll have those
Sorry, yeah.
described in more detail when we compile our adaptation plan. So that'll be clear what, for a given sub-area, what the bluff offset would be, or the shoreline offset would be to engage in these types of actions.
Yeah, to kind of touch on what he's saying though, in a way, other people, but are we gonna kind of have this broken down into like short term and long term? Obviously, the sea level rise is a long term thing, and we have these other flooding and 4 other events here on this page 4 at the top. There's 5 listed 5 items. One is long term, shoreline erosion, which is the sea level rise, and the other 4 items really look like they would fall into the short term. So I just wondered, do we break it down that way, with short term and long term?
Yes, so shoreline erosion would be a long-term issue. Sea level rise and for example, rising groundwater, that's a long-term issue that occurs slowly over time. And then on top, within that long-term process, there's also the potential increased impacts of storms. So there's two things to consider, both the long-term effects as well as storm effects. And so there'll be different triggers associated with those different processes. Long-term erosion would tell us when we want to re-nourish the beach. Considering storm erosion also gives us an indication, for the example I just gave with the raising the highway, when we might want to raise the highway because of a coastal storm could occur and impact the neighborhood or the different sub-area.
Well, I guess when Rob was talking about flooding South Park, I think it was short. Something short could happen next year if we have, a lot of rain.
Right, and so the fluvial source is considered for both of these areas where I'm standing right now in the West Linamar area as well as the Shark Park area. And so that fluvial exposure is also considered here, not just overtopping, which is the goal is to contain.
Rain.
Jim?
I wondered, often, and I haven't been able to get this question out, in the proposal from the city to the Coastal Commission and the Coastal Committee's award letter, all of the scenarios, they mentioned the inclusion of the baseline 0 sea level rise, or the baseline condition, the status quo right now, and that includes 100-year storms, events, and so on. So there's an existing condition, and I've always felt that as a baseline against which even the 17%, which appears to me to be the minimum scenario that is proposed to be included, it seems to me having the true baseline as a starting point, because there are hazards there that aren't very well met, especially if you think of a 100-year storm. I think it would be helpful to the community to see in context these progressive rates, which are triggered maybe at some point, we don't know, but seeing them in context of the true status quo might have some merit.
Yeah, we do have storm impacts for today's sea level as in this whole grouping of scenarios. So yeah, it is definitely important to compare things to what our current exposure is. Any questions or comments?
Well, I do want to acknowledge kind of your comment earlier that this document did come out very much recently and you didn't have a lot of time to process it. The adaptation plan, so I think one thing is some of the information, as you mentioned, is sort of recycled from previous documents. And this is really intended to be an interim document. So when the adaptation plan comes out, it'll have this information plus just more context and also more of the analysis that will help sort of put this all in its proper context. So this isn't the only bite at the apple here. There's going to be a sort of a longer time to get feedback or discussion around the adaptation options. So I want to make sure you knew that. But certainly recognize your comment is well taken. So next time that we'll be in this room will be the public workshop, and then this group is going to meet in the future to actually talk about the policy. All right. So we do have we're at 8:05, but I do want to take public comments. And one thing I might not have clarified earlier is this is public comment, so we don't have time for Q&A. It's just if you have a comment that you would like for the city to consider or the work group members to consider, we'd love to hear that. If you have questions, you can hang out, and I think the staff will be around to answer your questions. But we don't have time for a back and forth discussion, but we do need a comment. So if you have a comment, we'd like to get a queue so we can keep this organized. So I do have one comment card. If anyone has a comment, please fill out a card, raise your hand, we'll get it, and we'll go through these. So I have one, and this is Tony. So I'm just going to give you the microphone. Please keep your comment within 2 minutes, and I'll just invite you to make your comment.
Well, I'm glad you opened it up for public comment. I had a few on the card, but one strong comment I have is I was surprised that there was nothing in there about the replacement of the retaining wall on the north end of Sharp Park. You talk about maintenance, but maintenance is very different. It has a very specific meaning. As an accountant, maintenance is seal coating, epoxy and cracks, sonar testing, riprap, repairing a breach, but it specifically excludes replacement. And I think that was one of the most frequently brought up issues at the last public meeting. And if it was the intent to include that, I would ask that you specifically spell it out, because in the document it talks about maintenance, and anything that goes beyond maintenance was spelled out. It talked about extending the seawall to Clarendon Avenue. It talked about raising the height of the seawall, but it did not talk about replacing the north end, which is a retaining wall. And a retaining wall is somewhere between riprap and a seawall, and it should be considered. Like you said, it doesn't mean it's going to be done, but I'd like to see it added with specific wording into the analysis for the Sharp Park portion of the document.
Thank you, Tony.
Oh, and one additional comment along there is that I also think that is not a sea level trigger item. I know the last time we had a breach, it was $500,000. I think the total cost of replacement was $10 million with matching funding. So, the maintenance cost of that is pretty expensive. I know the north end had 3 breaches in 2016, and the south end, which has a seawall, had 0. So I would ask that trigger be at the no sea level rise item. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't have any. Raise your hand if you have a comment card and you'd like to be queued up. So Rhonda Johnson, I'll invite you just to take his microphone if you want to refer to that.
Sure. My comment is similar in the Sharp Park area, just because of the comments we made here about short-term, long-term. I do think that there is and are going to be issues that need to be addressed and how they're accounted for in the economic analysis as far as the costs. And I'm going back to this whole sea level and sea rise issue being different than what we need to do to make sure we're maintaining that seawall or replacing that seawall. That issue in that area is very vulnerable. And the whole Sharp Park analysis in this adaptation plan lumps together north and south of the pier when there are different scenarios there. So I think we really need to spell that out again as you're looking at what needs to be done and what the costs are and what the current sort of short-term need to protect that area.
Thank you. Victor Carmichael? Do you want to? Okay, come back this time. Can you hear your comment card?
It looks like that sand replacement is integral to each one of these politically acceptable solutions. And I wondered if there's enough of the right kind of sand. The grain is very important, as we know. And also, I think this perpetual sand replacement is going to be very expensive. I just wanted to make that comment. kind of a stopgap measure, but maybe the only one we have, but nevertheless, it seems like a kind of bad prospect.
Thank you. Letha Darrington, and I'm gonna request that you give those to us so we can have them for our record. Giving you your talking points here. Okay.
Helpful. So I just wanted to say that I'm pleased to see that the managed retreat is back among the analysis options. I know there are concerns about it, especially with the Earth interface with the Coastal Commission. But I believe it's important for city leadership and our residents to have the quantitative cost benefit analysis data on this option. I think that statement was made by our presenters, but I just want to affirm that as a community member. And I was at the last meeting, or well, not the last one, but the economic analysis meeting, and I mentioned a technique called surfonomics, which is an economic analysis technique to value the benefits of a wave to a community. I think, there's one mention of it on page 11 to 12 about sand retention structures as something that can benefit waves, either retain them or even augment them. And Lindemar is an economic engine for the community, and as other areas could be again. So I just wanted to bring that to everyone's attention.
Thank you. Brad?
Yeah. The discussion here today indicates that the engineering plan or an adaptation plan is not considering Shelter Cove as a part of the, or any part of the adaptation plans that are to be instituted. That's a disservice to the people in the Palo Plain communities above Shelter Coves, because within the erosion, they are within the erosion zone, so will be directly affected by the Shelter Cove community. More than half of the community that is projected to be within the erosion zone will be directly affected by that erosion off that back cove, Shelter Cove. I think that needs to be included and reevaluated.
That's right. Margaret Goodall? Margaret?
Hi, everybody. I'm Margaret Goodhill. I would like to ask everyone in this room to think about what you would like to have Pacifica look like in, say, 50 years. How would you envision this town to be in 50 years? And remember, sea level rise seems to be getting worse. What's going to be important to keep this town afloat? Not literally, hopefully, but please think about that as you consider all of these adaptations, alternative strategies. Think way far ahead. Probably very few of us in this room will be here in 50 years. But what would you like for those people? Please think about that too.
Thank you, Margaret. Any other, these are all the cards I have. Any other? Oh, Ron, you're back in there.
I know it.
Snuck in.
We're in that phase, I feel it's only fair.
Yeah, recently there was an article in the Chronicle, not quite a week ago, but on kind of creative ways of dealing with civil rights, sea level rise, structures that maybe have multiple purposes. For instance, if we were to do these, maybe some kind of lateral berms going out there, could we incorporate pieces of kind of interpretive walkways where people, maybe it could be something that people could use to, like a small observation thing people could walk out of, rather than just being just a bunch of rocks going out and the lateral string of rocks, but or even seawalls that might have something attached to the back or like benches or I'm just throwing out this example of there are creative designs that are being used in other parts of the world in terms of sea level rise or structures can, in some cases, not all, in some cases, have multiple uses beyond just keeping water. Okay, so that's what
Thank you, Ron. Jim, do you have anything?
Can I make a comment?
That's not fair.
It's correct, it's been mentioned by a couple people that sand renourishment comes up a few times, and groins, man-made, what you call them, beach, groins will do. I'm not a beach dynamics person, but at a cocktail party, if someone asked, I would have said both of those have been used a lot in the past and found to really be expensive and they're only short-term benefit. The beach immersion never really works long-term, and it's a continuous expense. It's like money down a rat hole or something. And the groins cause almost as many problems as they hope to solve because they interrupt the flow of sands in various ways. I'm concerned that we include in many of our alternative scenarios options which I thought had been dismissed as not very effective. And I'm not an expert, so I can't say that with confidence, but chatting with a few people around town, they're also surprised at that. So I know I'm not alone in it, and I know that engineers are working on the problem, but it's so tempting to say, can do, the engineering approach is we can do this, but we've tried this a lot, and it really hasn't worked at the very least. It's very expensive.
Okay.
Every strategy is expensive, every single one. It's a huge expense.
But if it's expensive and doesn't work.
Well, I mean, I think part of what James was alluding to earlier is we're using the sort of most available and best information we have, and the hope is over time, if we learn that there are new strategies that are more effective, we adapt accordingly. So I think the idea is to do the best that we can with what we have, prioritize because things are expensive, and we just, it's a work over time. Sorry I went over a little late. I'm going to go check the score. I'm not going to tell you. But thank you all for coming. We hope to see you on the 23rd. We'll have more information for you on the adaptation strategy. Thank you for coming today.
Thanks again, everyone.